We start off with Africa and the Middle East. That's chapter 29. Essentially, after World War II, these African nations that had been conquered by Europe were given their independence. They were not ready for it. Now, I want to tell you a personal experience. When I was not old, I was attending this church, and a preacher from Africa came, a missionary, and he said, now, I came from the Belgian Congo, and we saw this man carrying a suitcase. And we asked, why are you carrying a suitcase around? Well, he said, Belgium has promised us freedom next year, and when they give it to us, I want to be able to collect plenty of it, so I'm going to have a big suitcase ready so I can carry more of it around. This supposedly actually happened in 1960. Belgium did give the Congo their independence. And I would like to be able to tell you, hey, these people moved on to develop great nations. They didn't. Africa, folk, has more natural resources than any country, I mean, any continent on earth. More than any. Russia is second. They have gold, they have diamonds, they have tin, they have iron, and I don't know what all else. But a lot of it. And yet, they have not been able to organize into nations. Their first move, and here's where they went wrong, as soon as these nations would get their independence from their mother country, their first move would be to get together and try to form a socialistic state, believing socialism was the cure-all, take care, and they didn't have any wealth to share, folks. Instead of sharing their wealth, they wound up sharing their poverty. And what would happen was one dictator would take over and he'd rule till he got too much discontent against him, he'd be overthrown, and another dictator would take over till he got overthrown, and then another dictator would take over and he got overthrown. And this went on, one after another. Your book shows a map of Africa on page 859. Again, some of these countries are in really bad shape. Now, one of them I want to emphasize is South Africa and its policy of apartheid. The white minority, and whites only made up 10% of the population of South Africa, they were determined for a long time they were not going to give up control of the blacks. They said the blacks would take our property and take their land. And this kept South Africa at odds with the whole world. They finally, in 1990, gave up control and turned over control to the black majority. The leader was Nelson Mandela, and Mandela was to govern South Africa for the last years of his life, and Mandela made news. He died just a few months back. I don't remember exactly when it was.
September of last year.
September? December of last year. I knew it wasn't long ago. Anyway, Nelson Mandela governed South Africa until ill health forced him to resign, but he lived a long time. I mean, he lived many years of his life in a South African prison. He was a close friend of Dr. Martin Luther King. They both shared a common goal. But, anyway, African nations were often approached by communists, and the communist nation would come in and say, hey, we know what you need, we can solve your problems, if you'll just let us have this, this, or this kind of control, we can do such and such for you. And the result was the United States had to try to move in and keep the communists out. Communism, nevertheless, did take over Angola for a while, and took over Ethiopia for a while. But most of your South African nations did not fall under the sway of communism. They instead, a lot of them tried to embrace socialism, which is, I can't say that did them any good. A big problem that they had was the problem of AIDS. At one time it was said that at least 1/3 of every African was infected with the AIDS virus, and it was so bad that if a person wanted to hire help, he'd have to hire 3 persons to fill one job, because he reasoned that one of them would be dead of AIDS soon. The other one would have to stop work to try to help take care of someone who was dying of AIDS. So of the 3 persons he hired, one of them might eventually be able to work for him. The AIDS crisis is still going on, but it's somewhat modified. Thanks to help the United States, they've moved in and began giving these people the drug cocktails. They're expensive, but nevertheless keep AIDS patients alive. Again, main thing you want to remember about South Africa, they've had a difficult time handling the independence that they have, and gone through mostly the countries have gone through one dictatorship after another. Democracy seems to have had a difficult time making any headway. Now, folk, I wish I could say something positive about them. I have a difficult time doing so. If any of you know anything you can say. They do have a big population, what the book calls a population bomb. Big population increase in spite of the AIDS epidemic. Yeah, Angola and Ethiopia, they're the 2 countries that Marxist. Your book talks about on page 863. Socialism, they seemingly can't even make capitalism work. All right. A big problem that you have in African societies is sometimes an African male will say to his wife and children, I'm going to the big city and get a job, and once I've gotten a job and gotten set up, I'll send for you. He goes to the big city and his family never hears from him again. Typical of what happens so often among African people. They try to educate themselves, hoping for an improved life. Seemingly very little they can do actually works. All right, that's really all I want to say about Africa. I will move on to Palestine, the Islamic region. Essentially, I've already talked about how after World War II, the United Nations got together and voted to partition the land of Palestine, where the Jews would have the land that they were living on, and the Arabs would have their land. The Arabs have objected seriously. There have been 4 wars fought. The first war was fought in 1948, and it ended when the Arabs simply said, well, we'll come back later. Time is on our side. In 1956, they fought again, and this time it was a rout. In 1967, right as I was graduating from high school, June 1967, there was a war called the Six-Day War, and it was a big rout, with the Israelis blowing the Arabs off the battlefield. In 1973, there was another war that this time was not such a big rout, but then the Arabs realized that time was not on their side. They could not beat the Israelis in warfare, so then they resorted to terrorism. There has not been a major confrontation, but there's been just a bunch of terroristic acts. Rockets are shot into Israel almost every day. And again, a lot of times they don't hit anything, but a lot of times they hit civilians. Now, the Arabs are upset at the United States and blame the United States. And I have to ask a question. I've been asked, what good has it done the United States to support Israel? Here's my take on it, folk. I'll answer it. What the United States has gained has been peace in our time. Why? The Arabs received their weapons from the Soviet Union. The Israelis received their weapons from the United States. When the 2 systems clashed, the Israelis using American weapons and the Arabs using Soviet weapons, the result was a rout. A military rout. Don't think the Kremlin leaders didn't notice, and it proved that American weaponry was far, far better than Soviet-made weaponry. In fact, Nasser, the president of Egypt, said, you buy a tank from Russia, it doesn't work. Get a tank from the United States and it does. I mean, what it would be like, think of the chaos, if half of you go out and find that half the cars out here won't start. If you live in Russia, probably about a fourth of your cars wouldn't start when you got outside, and somebody have to jump you off, push you off, or get a mechanic out here to tow you in. I mean, it happens once in a while. I went out to my car one time late at night and found a tire flat, and it created a big inconvenience for me, I'll say, because when they bolted the bolts on so tight in these dealerships anymore, it's really difficult to get one loose. Really difficult, but it doesn't happen very often. But again, why did we benefit? The Soviet Union did not dare fight us. That's where we benefited. Now, if any of you, we got a few minutes, but if you want to argue the other side of the point, one of your classmates talk about how terrible the United States is for supporting Israel, and if you think that's fine, but the reason Israel exists today, it's not because of the United States' help. Here's the problem. Egypt is fighting against Egypt. I'm talking about this moment. Syria is fighting a hard war against Syria. Tunisia is fighting Tunisia. Libya is fighting Libya. Yemen is fighting Yemen. And Israel sits in the middle of that and enjoys some moments of peace while the Arabs fight among themselves. Islam would have conquered the world. But anybody remember what I said? Why didn't they?
They stuck to the old ways.
They what?
They stuck to their
They started going after each other. They stayed at each other's throats. But they probably would have conquered the world. But of course, they have another problem. They can fight well in the open desert. They don't fight well where there's a lot of trees. Their horsemen, their cavalry just simply are not as effective. But they fight well in the open desert. All right, folks.